When the world thinks of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, they remember the radiant smile of a fashion icon and the tragic silhouette of a wife retrieving pieces of her husband's skull on the trunk of a blood-soaked limousine. But behind the velvet curtain of Camelot lay a brutal reality of relentless betrayal, secret drug injections inside the White House, a vicious shadow war with her own sister, and a leaked nude photograph orchestrated by her billionaire husband to publicly humiliate her. Jackie was never just a first lady. She was the ultimate survivor of the 20th century's most ruthless power games. Jacqueline Lee Bouvier was born on July 28, 1929, into the wealthy elite of New York. Her life began inside a highly dysfunctional marriage. Her father, John Verneau Bouvier III, known as Black Jack, was a stockbroker. He drank heavily, gambled, and engaged in serial affairs. Her mother, Janet Lee, was a pragmatic woman who demanded strict social order and financial security. She did not tolerate her husband's public indiscretions. By 1936, the marriage collapsed. Janet wanted a divorce on her terms, which required concrete proof of adultery. She hired a Scandinavian woman to seduce her husband, creating a setup to secure the evidence she needed. The ensuing divorce was highly publicized and bitter. At 11 years old, Jackie reacted to her family's collapse with absolute silence. She did not throw tantrums. She withdrew entirely. She learned immediately that showing emotion made her vulnerable. She spent her time reading and riding horses. Equestrianism became her primary coping mechanism. It required physical control, strict discipline, and a blank facial expression, regardless of whether she won a ribbon or fell off the horse. She learned to control the animal, which translated into learning how to control her own public image. In 1942, her mother made a strategic move. Janet married Hugh Dudley Auchincloss Jr., an heir to the Standard Oil fortune. This marriage provided massive financial stability. Janet moved Jackie and her younger sister, Caroline Lee, into Auchincloss's massive estates, Marywood in Virginia and Hammersmith Farm in Rhode Island. They were forced to integrate with his 4 children from previous marriages. Jackie rejected this new arrangement. At 13 years old, she refused to attend her mother's wedding. She moved into the estates and accepted the financial benefits, but she maintained a strict emotional distance from her stepfather and her mother's new life. Despite his absence, Black Jack remained the dominant psychological force in Jackie's life. He manipulated both of his daughters, but he explicitly favored Jackie. She looked like him, sharing his dark features. He frequently told her she was the most beautiful daughter a man could have, ensuring her sister Lee heard it. This blatant favoritism created a permanent rift between the sisters. Lee, 3.5 years younger, was forced to compete for basic attention. They fought constantly over money, approval, and men. It was a rivalry engineered by their father. This hostility became public in August 1947 at Jackie's debutante ball in Newport. The event was designed to introduce Jackie to society and secure her status. Lee retaliated against her sister's spotlight. She arrived at the party wearing a strapless pink dress covered in rhinestones. It was an outfit designed for an older woman, worn specifically to draw the attention of the photographers and guests away from Jackie. Jackie ignored the provocation publicly, maintaining her polite facade, but the event established a pattern of sabotage that would define their relationship for the rest of their lives. Jackie was highly educated. She attended Vassar College, spent a year in Paris at the Sorbonne, and finished her degree at George Washington University. She was intelligent, but she knew that men in her social circle found outspoken women threatening. She learned to mask her intellect behind a quiet, breathy voice and a passive demeanor. In 1951, she entered Vogue magazine's Prix de Paris contest. She competed against hundreds of women and won a 1-year junior editor position, split between Paris and New York. It was a direct path to an independent career. She quit on her first day. Her mother convinced her that taking a demanding job, especially one that took her to Paris, would ruin her chances of finding a wealthy husband. Jackie prioritized Social Security over the editorial job and left the magazine immediately. However, she did not stay unemployed. She used her connections to get a job at the Washington Times-Herald as the inquiring camera girl. The job required her to walk the streets of Washington, D.C., approach strangers and politicians, take their photographs, and ask them pointed questions about politics, money, and relationships. She interviewed Richard Nixon and covered the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. The job taught her how to approach powerful people, how to ask direct questions, and how to operate the press. During this time, she got engaged to John Husted, a Wall Street stockbroker. He was exactly the type of man her mother wanted her to marry: respectable, steadily employed, and socially acceptable. Jackie broke off the engagement after 3 months. She looked at Husted's income, his predictable career, and his personality, and decided he was entirely inadequate. She bluntly described him as immature and boring. She realized she did not want a quiet life in the suburbs with a standard broker. She wanted power, and she was willing to wait for a man who could provide a much larger platform. In May 1952, Jacqueline Bouvier attended a small dinner party in Georgetown hosted by journalist Charles Bartlett. Bartlett had a specific agenda. He wanted to introduce Jackie to John F. Kennedy, a young, wealthy, and highly ambitious Democratic congressman from Massachusetts who was gearing up for a Senate run. There was no romance, no sudden spark, and no love at first sight. Jackie approached the introduction with the same cold, analytical observations she applied to the politicians she interviewed for her newspaper column. Kennedy was charming, but Jackie was entirely unimpressed by his physical presence. Later that night, she wrote a blunt assessment in her private diary, noting his funny body, skinny with toothpick legs. She saw exactly who he was. A man relentlessly focused on his own ascent, accustomed to getting whatever he wanted through wealth and sheer force of personality. When JFK eventually proposed, Jackie did not immediately say yes. She made him wait an entire month. She packed her bags, traveled to London to cover the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II for the Washington Times-Herald, and deliberately left him waiting for an answer. She wanted to establish a baseline of independence before agreeing to merge her life with a man who clearly expected women to orbit around him. The marriage was, fundamentally, a high-stakes corporate merger. The architect of this alliance was not JFK, but his father, Joseph Kennedy Sr. Joe Sr., was a self-made multimillionaire with ruthless political ambitions for his sons, but he knew his family had a problem. The Kennedys were viewed by the American establishment as Irish Catholic new money. They were loud, aggressively competitive, and politically ruthless. To reach the White House, Joe Sr. knew his son needed a powerful stabilizing force. He needed a woman who possessed undeniable social pedigree, high-level education, and impeccable aristocratic style. Jackie Bouvier, with her French surname, Vassar education, and Newport background, was the perfect political asset. Jackie's mother, Janet Leigh, approved the match for entirely different reasons. She saw the Kennedy fortune as an impenetrable financial fortress for her daughter. Both families viewed the union as a transaction that served their respective interests. The timeline of the engagement also carried the sting of sibling rivalry. In April 1953, Jackie's younger sister Leigh married Michael Canfield, a publishing heir. Leigh had beaten Jackie to the altar, securing her own wealthy husband and stepping into the spotlight. 2 months later, in June 1953, Jackie officially announced her engagement to the newly elected Senator Kennedy. The wedding took place on September 12, 1953, in Newport, Rhode Island. It was not an intimate celebration of a young couple. It was a massive, highly orchestrated political convention. Joseph Kennedy Sr. hijacked the guest list, inviting heavy-hitting politicians, media moguls, and Hollywood elite. Over 700 people crammed into St. Mary's Church, and 200 guests attended the sprawling reception at Hammersmith Farm. Jackie was completely overshadowed at her own wedding, serving as a decorative prop in the Kennedy family's master plan. The reality of the marriage hit Jackie immediately, and it was brutally familiar. JFK was a mirror image of her father, Black Jack Bouvier. Both men possessed an insatiable need for female validation, and both viewed women purely as conquests. JFK loved the thrill of the chase, but the moment a woman was secured, he became instantly bored. He engaged in serial infidelity, openly pursuing secretaries, actresses, and socialites. He used these affairs to prove his own virility, and when Jackie inevitably reacted with coldness, he turned resentful, blaming her for his own indiscretions. Jackie had been trained since childhood to look the other way when wealthy men misbehaved. Her mother had taught her that financial security came at the cost of personal dignity. But the sheer volume and blatant nature of JFK's cheating pushed her to her psychological limits. The marriage deteriorated rapidly. Jackie became isolated, depressed, and increasingly aware that she was trapped in an arrangement that demanded her total submission. The situation became so volatile that Joseph Kennedy Sr. had to intervene to protect his investment. Joe Sr. knew that a divorce would instantly destroy his son's chances of ever becoming president in the conservative political climate of the 1950s. According to an unpublished biography by a close associate, Joe Sr. sat down with his daughter-in-law and offered her a blunt financial ultimatum. He offered Jackie $1 million in cash simply to stay in the marriage and endure JFK's constant infidelity without causing a public scandal. He then added a chilling caveat. The payout would be increased to $20 million if JFK ever infected her with a sexually transmitted disease. It was a stark confirmation of her reality. She was not a wife. She was an employee on a high-risk retainer. The psychological toll of her husband's betrayals was compounded by extreme physical trauma. Jackie's attempts to provide the Kennedy family with an heir were disastrous. She endured 5 pregnancies during her marriage, but only 2 children survived. In 1955, she suffered a traumatic miscarriage. A year later, in August 1956, the true cruelty of her marriage was exposed to the public. Jackie was in her 3rd trimester of pregnancy, resting in Newport. JFK was at the Democratic National Convention, where he narrowly lost a bid to be the vice presidential nominee. Exhausted and frustrated by the political defeat, JFK decided he needed a vacation. He boarded a yacht and sailed to the Mediterranean with a group of friends and a rotation of young women. While her husband was partying off the coast of Europe, Jackie suffered massive hemorrhaging. She was rushed to the hospital and underwent emergency surgery, delivering a stillborn daughter they named Arabella. Jackie woke up from the anesthesia without her baby and without her husband. When JFK was finally reached via radio on the yacht and informed that his wife had nearly died and his daughter was dead, he refused to cut his trip short. He planned to continue his vacation. It was only when a political friend bluntly informed him that abandoning his grieving wife would be viewed as a monstrous act and would permanently ruin his political career that JFK reluctantly boarded a flight back to the United States. The stillbirth of Arabella and JFK's blatant abandonment almost ended the marriage. Jackie was fully prepared to file for divorce. The Kennedy family went into high alert. They deployed every resource they had to prevent her from leaving. Joe Sr. stepped in with financial reassurances, while JFK's sisters were sent to pacify her. They convinced her that a divorce would destroy everything they had all worked for. Jackie stayed, but the incident permanently hardened her. She no longer had any illusions about the man she married. By 1960, JFK officially launched his campaign for the presidency of the United States. Jackie was pregnant again. Despite her intense hatred of crowds, her innate shyness, and her physical exhaustion, the Kennedy campaign recognized her as their most lethal weapon. Whenever Jackie appeared at a rally, the crowd size doubled. Voters were captivated by her youth, her poise, and her distinct lack of typical political aggression. She utilized her extensive education to outmaneuver older, more established political wives. She addressed crowds in fluent French, Spanish, and Italian, securing vital immigrant votes in key swing states. When her pregnancy forced her onto bed rest, she did not step back. She grabbed a pen and began writing a syndicated weekly newspaper column titled Campaign Wife. The column was a brilliant piece of public relations. She wrote relatable, charming anecdotes about her husband and their domestic life, manufacturing a flawless image of a happy, unified family that completely contradicted the grim reality of their private arrangement. On November 8, 1960, John F. Kennedy narrowly won the presidential election, defeating Richard Nixon. Jackie had delivered exactly what Joe Kennedy Sr. paid for. She had provided the visual proof of a perfect American family, pushing JFK over the finish line. Just 2.5 weeks later, on November 25, 1960, the physical toll of the campaign caught up with her. Jackie went into premature labor. John F. Kennedy Jr. was born 3 weeks early. The delivery was a severe medical emergency. The infant was struggling to survive, his lungs not fully developed. Doctors had to manually blow air into the newborn's lungs to keep him breathing. As the country celebrated the dawn of a new, glamorous political era, Jackie was in a hospital bed, fighting for her son's life, preparing to enter the White House with a man she fundamentally did not trust. In January 1961, John F. Kennedy was inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States, and Jacqueline Kennedy became the First Lady at just 31 years old. To the American public, the transition of power felt like the dawn of a vibrant, flawless new era. The press quickly dubbed their administration Camelot, a mythical kingdom of high ideals, youth, and unblemished glamour. But Camelot was a brilliant, manufactured illusion. The White House was not a fairy tale castle. It was a high-stakes theater, and Jackie was its chief architect. Upon moving into the executive mansion, Jackie was appalled by its condition. It looked like a drab, neglected hotel, furnished with cheap reproductions and discarded department store pieces. She immediately recognized that the White House was the ultimate physical manifestation of American power, and it needed to project undeniable cultural supremacy, especially during the freezing heights of the Cold War. She did not simply redecorate. She launched a massive, ruthless, and highly organized historical restoration project. She formed a fine arts committee, strong-armed wealthy donors into returning stolen or sold presidential artifacts, and scoured museum archives. She treated the White House like a diplomatic weapon. In 1962, she hosted a televised tour of the restored mansion for CBS. 80 million people tuned in. She won a special Emmy Award for the broadcast. She had single-handedly transformed the role of the First Lady from a silent hostess into a cultural powerhouse, eventually helping to lay the groundwork for the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. The media was completely hypnotized by her. During a highly publicized state visit to Paris in 1961, JFK famously introduced himself to the press corps by saying, "I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris." Time magazine formally crowned her the First Lady of Fashion, yet, behind the flawless public relations strategy, the private reality was unraveling. The tension between Jackie and her sister, Lee Radziwill, was reaching a breaking point. The great irony of Jackie's status as a global fashion icon was that she was heavily relying on Lee's expertise. It was Lee, living in London and deeply embedded in European high society, who acted as Jackie's secret stylist. Lee was the one coordinating with Hubert de Givenchy and selecting the sleek, modern silhouettes that would define the Jackie look. Lee did the work, but Jackie absorbed all the global worship. The sisterly resentment boiled over into public humiliation during a highly publicized, semi-official goodwill tour of India and Pakistan in 1962. Lee accompanied Jackie on the trip. Everywhere they went, massive crowds numbering in the hundreds of thousands swarmed their motorcades. But the crowds only screamed one name. They threw flowers only at Jackie. Lee was forced to sit in the background, a silent, ignored prop in her sister's rolling coronation. The humiliation was unbearable for Lee, and Jackie knew it. Jackie possessed a quiet, vindictive streak. and she knew exactly how to punish her sister for past slights. Later that year, Lee, desperate to step out of Jackie's shadow, attempted to launch an acting career. She secured the starring role in a Chicago stage production of The Philadelphia Story. It was a critical moment for Lee's ego. Jackie deliberately, pointedly refused to attend the premiere. She let her sister face the brutal theater critics alone. The message was clear. Jackie controlled the spotlight, and she would not share it. Inside the White House, the Kennedys maintained an iron grip on their public image. Jackie hired a dedicated press secretary, Pamela Turneur, to aggressively manage the media and kill any unflattering stories. This absolute control of the press was vital, because the reality of the Kennedys' daily lives was descending into severe chemical dependency and reckless depravity. The image of youthful vigor projected by the president and the first lady was a complete medical fabrication. JFK suffered from debilitating, agonizing back pain and Addison's disease. Jackie was exhausted, dealing with the intense pressures of her role and severe postpartum depression following the traumatic birth of John Jr. To maintain their grueling schedules, they turned to Dr. Max Jacobson, a physician known in elite circles as Dr. Feelgood. Jacobson was not practicing standard medicine. He was administering potent, highly addictive injections known as IV specials. These syringes were loaded with a terrifying cocktail of methamphetamine, animal hormones, steroids, human placenta, and heavy doses of vitamins. JFK introduced Jackie to the treatments to help her push through her depression and gear up for the grueling 1961 Paris summit. The results were instantaneous. The methamphetamine provided a massive surge of artificial energy, extreme focus, and a feeling of invincibility. It allowed them to project the boundless energy the public expected, but the side effects were monstrous. The heavy reliance on amphetamines induced severe mood swings, paranoia, and manic episodes. The chemical dependency reached a terrifying peak in 1962. According to Secret Service details and insider accounts, JFK experienced an extreme psychotic reaction to one of Jacobson's injections, leading to an incident where the President of the United States was seen running completely naked and manic down the hallways of the Carlyle Hotel in New York. The administration quietly panicked. By the end of 1962, the Secret Service and the White House physician forced Jacobson out, banning him from treating the president. But the damage to their physical and psychological baselines had already been done. The drugs only fueled JFK's worst impulses. His serial infidelity, which Jackie had expected to wane under the scrutiny of the presidency, actually accelerated. The White House, heavily guarded and insulated from the public, became his private playground. The betrayals were not just political. They were intimately cruel. The most devastating cut came from within her own family. According to authors Gore Vidal and Michael Canfield, who was Lee Radziwill's first husband, Lee had openly bragged about carrying on a passionate, physical affair with JFK before he was elected president. Whether Jackie knew the full extent of this ultimate betrayal at the time is debated, but she was acutely aware of the dangerous, flirtatious dynamic between her husband and her sister. Inside the executive mansion, JFK's behavior was recklessly brazen. In the summer of 1962, a 19-year-old college student named Mimi Alford arrived at the White House for a press office internship. Within 4 days of her arrival, JFK invited her to a private pool party, gave her a personal tour of the residence, and took her into Jackie's own bedroom. There, he took the teenager's virginity on the First Lady's bed. The affair lasted for 18 months. JFK treated Alford not as a romantic partner, but as a submissive object. The encounters were deeply degrading. At one point, JFK pressured Alford into using amyl nitrite, a popular club drug known as poppers that causes a sudden head rush and muscle relaxation during their encounters. In another incident, he aggressively urged Alford to perform oral sex on his close friend and aide, Dave Powers. While JFK watched, Jackie was not blind. She knew exactly what was happening in the West Wing and the private quarters. Her survival mechanism was total compartmentalization and a weaponized, icy sarcasm. She refused to give her husband the satisfaction of a screaming match. Instead, she let him know she saw everything. Walking past the desk of a White House secretary named Priscilla Ware, another known mistress, Jackie turned to a French journalist and smoothly translated, "This is the girl who is supposedly sleeping with my husband." There was only one woman who genuinely terrified Jackie, and it was not because JFK loved her. It was because she was entirely unpredictable. Marilyn Monroe was a massive liability. Monroe was deeply unstable, heavily medicated, and utterly convinced that the president was going to leave his wife for her. Monroe's delusion reached a peak when she managed to bypass the White House switchboard and called the private residence directly. Jackie picked up the phone. Monroe brazenly told the First Lady that JFK had promised to marry her and that she would be moving in. Jackie did not yell. She did not hang up. She used the precise, terrifying coldness she had learned from watching her mother. "Marilyn, that's great," Jackie replied evenly. "You'll marry Jack, and you'll move into the White House, and you'll assume the responsibilities of First Lady. And I'll move out, and you'll have all the problems." It was a psychological kill shot. Monroe had no idea how to respond to a woman who viewed the presidency not as a romance, but as a grueling corporate job. Despite the sheer toxicity of their arrangement, the public facade held firm until tragedy struck again. In August 1963, Jackie was resting at Otis Air Force Base in Massachusetts. She went into premature labor 5 weeks early. She gave birth to a son, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy. The baby was suffering from hyaline membrane disease, a severe respiratory distress syndrome common in premature infants. For 39 agonizing hours, the nation watched as doctors fought to save the child. It was futile. Patrick died. The loss completely broke Jackie. The stoic armor she had worn since she was an 11-year-old girl enduring her parents' divorce finally cracked. She fell into a deep, paralyzing depression. She could not function. She could not smile for the cameras. She was a mother mourning her third lost child, trapped in a marriage defined by chemical enhancement and relentless betrayal. Desperate to get her out of the White House and away from the suffocating grief, her sister Lee intervened. Lee suggested that Jackie take a vacation to recuperate. The invitation came from Lee's current lover, the immensely wealthy Greek shipping magnate, Aristotle Onassis. Onassis offered his luxurious private yacht, the Christina, for Jackie to cruise the Aegean Sea for 4 weeks. Jackie accepted. The political optics were terrible. The press heavily criticized the First Lady for taking a lavish, hedonistic vacation with a foreign billionaire, while the American public mourned her baby. But Jackie no longer cared about the optics. She was suffocating. The trip to Onassis's yacht was a pivotal moment. The previous summer, while Jackie was 7 months pregnant with Patrick, it was Lee who had stepped in to fulfill the duties of the First Lady, accompanying JFK on a diplomatic trip to Europe. Now, Jackie was stepping onto the boat of the man her sister intended to marry. The tangled web of loyalty, jealousy, and power between the Bouvier sisters and the Kennedy machine was fraying beyond repair. Jackie returned from the yacht in mid-November 1963, somewhat rested but still deeply fragile. She agreed to accompany her husband on a vital political trip to Texas to help mend a fractured Democratic Party ahead of the upcoming election. She packed her bags, including a striking pink Chanel suit, entirely unaware that the illusion of Camelot was about to be violently and permanently obliterated in the streets of Dallas. The political landscape of late 1963 was volatile. John F. Kennedy was looking ahead to the 1964 election, but he had a massive problem in the South. The Democratic Party in Texas was bitterly divided between its liberal and conservative wings. To win a second term, JFK needed to unify them, and he knew exactly what weapon to deploy. His wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, had barely recovered from the agonizing death of her newborn son, Patrick, just 3 months earlier. She was emotionally brittle and physically exhausted. Yet she understood the transactional nature of her position. She agreed to accompany her husband on a 2-day, 5-city tour of Texas. It would be her first extended domestic political trip since the 1960 campaign. On the morning of November 22, 1963, in Fort Worth, Texas, the strategy was already working flawlessly. The crowds were deafening. JFK was thrilled, turning to his aides and remarking on how easily Jackie captivated the room. She was wearing a vibrant pink suit with a navy blue collar and a matching pillbox hat. While history remembers it as Chanel, it was actually an exact line-for-line reproduction created by the New York design house Chez Nino, a deliberate choice to avoid political criticism for wearing foreign designers. It was her armor. They flew the short distance to Dallas, touching down at Love Field. The motorcade route into the city center was lined with over 200,000 people. The plexiglass bubble top of the presidential Lincoln Continental limousine had been removed to allow the president and first lady to engage directly with the public. It was a beautiful, unnervingly warm autumn day. As the motorcade turned slowly past the Texas School Book Depository and into Dealey Plaza, the illusion of American invulnerability was shattered in a matter of seconds. The first shot sounded like a motorcycle backfiring. Then came the second, and the third. When the final bullet struck the president's head, the reality was not cinematic. It was a sudden, catastrophic explosion of blood, bone and brain tissue that covered the interior of the car and drenched the First Lady. In that fraction of a second, Jackie Kennedy did not act out of bravery or calculated heroism. She acted entirely on primal, uncontrollable trauma. Driven by a visceral, animalistic reflex, she climbed out of her seat and crawled backward onto the flat trunk of the speeding, swerving limousine. She was not trying to escape. She was reaching out to retrieve a piece of her husband's skull that had been blown onto the metal. Ocrit service agent Clint Hill sprinted to the back of the car, grabbed her, and forced her back into the seat as the vehicle accelerated toward Parkland Memorial Hospital. Later in life, Jackie would have absolutely no memory of crawling onto the trunk. Her brain had completely blacked out the moment to protect her sanity. At Parkland Hospital, the chaos was absolute. Doctors and nurses rushed JFK into Trauma Room 1. The protocol was to keep family members out of the resuscitation room, but Jackie was immovable. When medical staff tried to forcefully guide her out, she locked eyes with the president's personal physician, Dr. George Berkeley, and delivered a line of pure, terrifying authority. "I want to be in there when he dies," she said. They let her stay. She stood quietly in the corner of the blood-slicked room, watching the doctors perform desperate, futile chest compressions and a tracheotomy on her husband. She saw the catastrophic extent of the wound. She knew he was gone long before they officially called the time of death at 1 p.m. The immediate aftermath was a masterclass in psychological warfare and image control. Just hours after watching her husband's head explode, Jackie was escorted to Air Force One for the flight back to Washington. The political machine was already grinding forward. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson needed to be sworn in immediately to ensure the continuity of government, and he knew he needed Jackie by his side to legitimize the chaotic transfer of power. Jackie was completely covered in her husband's blood. Her face was streaked with it. The pink suit was soaked dark red down the skirt. Her stockings were saturated. Lady Bird Johnson, the new First Lady, gently approached Jackie and offered to find her a clean dress to change into before the swearing-in photograph was taken. The aides surrounding them desperately wanted to sanitize the scene. They wanted the blood out of sight. Jackie refused. She stood up, her face entirely blank, and delivered a sentence that would echo through American history. "No," she said. "Let them see what they have done." She stood next to LBJ as he took the oath of office, making sure the camera captured the bloodstains on her sleeve. She refused to wash her face until she was back in the White House. She weaponized her trauma, turning her ruined clothing into a permanent, damning indictment of the political violence that had stolen her husband. She would not let the establishment look away from the gore. Returning to Washington, the 34-year-old widow immediately seized absolute control over her husband's legacy. She was not going to allow the politicians to dictate how JFK was remembered. Still in shock, unable to sleep, she stayed up late into the night reading historical texts. She modeled JFK's funeral arrangements directly after the state funeral of Abraham Lincoln. She demanded a closed casket, refusing to let the public see the damage. She requested the riderless horse with boots reversed in the stirrups. She dictated the procession route. She ordered the family to walk behind the caisson instead of riding in armored cars, projecting a fearless imperial image to the world. And she taught her 3-year-old son, John Jr., exactly how to salute his father's casket on his birthday. Through sheer willpower, she orchestrated a flawless, majestic farewell that united a terrified nation. The world watched in awe as the first widow stood draped in a black veil, an unshakable pillar of stoic grace. But the most brilliant, calculating move of her life happened exactly 1 week after the assassination. Jackie knew that a presidency cut short at 1,000 days could easily be viewed by history as a failure. A brief, unfinished administration plagued by the Bay of Pigs disaster and escalating tensions in Vietnam. She was determined to rewrite that narrative. On November 29, she summoned Theodore H. White, a highly respected political journalist for Life magazine, to the Kennedy compound in Hyannis Port. She dictated the terms of the interview. She spoke for hours in her quiet, breathless voice, comparing JFK's administration to the mythical idyllic court of King Arthur. Don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot, for one brief shining moment, that was known as Camelot, she told White. There will be great presidents again, but there will never be another Camelot. White published the piece exactly as she framed it. With that single interview, Jackie Kennedy single-handedly authored the enduring, bulletproof myth of the Kennedy years. She blinded the historians. She erased the drug use, the infidelities, and the political missteps, replacing them with a permanent, glowing legend. Once the myth was secured, the public stopped watching, and that was when Jackie finally collapsed. Behind the doors of her new apartment at 1040 Fifth Avenue in New York City, the Iron Widow disintegrated. Moving away from Washington, D.C. did not erase the ghosts. The reality of 1964 and 1965 was defined by severe, undiagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder. She drank heavily. She suffered from paralyzing insomnia. She wept uncontrollably when she was alone. The grief was compounded by a profound, furious crisis of faith. Jackie had been raised a strict Catholic, but Dallas destroyed her belief in a benevolent God. Desperate for a lifeline, she began a secret correspondence with Father Richard McSorley, a Jesuit priest. Her letters to him were raw, violent, and utterly devoid of the polished elegance the public knew. She confessed to profound anger. She questioned why a sniper's bullet would take a vibrant president but spare a dictator. More alarmingly, she repeatedly confessed to suicidal ideation. She wrote that the only reason she did not kill herself to reunite with Jack was the knowledge that doing so would ruin her children's lives. In her darkest psychological hour, she turned to her family for support. What she received was a masterclass in high society coldness. Her mother, Janet Auchincloss, found Jackie's intense grieving tedious and socially inconvenient. The American aristocracy did not dwell on pain. They buried it and moved on. Just 8 months after the assassination, Janet looked at her severely depressed daughter and bluntly told her she needed to get over it. There was no empathy, only a demand for compliance. Alienated by her mother and unable to shatter her perfect public image, Jackie sought comfort in the shadows. She needed an anchor, but her status as an American saint made normal dating impossible. Any man seen with her would be endlessly compared to the martyred president. She found a quiet, intensely private romance with John Carl Warnecke. Warnke was a prominent architect, the man she had personally selected to design the eternal flame for JFK's gravesite at Arlington National Cemetery. They bonded over blueprints and grief. Warnke was one of the few people who saw the messy, broken woman behind the veil. They spent hours walking the empty grounds of Arlington at night, discussing design while navigating her trauma. The relationship deepened into a genuine, passionate love affair. Warnke wanted to marry her, but the pressure of the Kennedy machine and the public's ownership of her image created an impenetrable wall. Furthermore, Warnke was dealing with massive financial debts. Jackie, fully aware of how quickly money could vanish, knew she could not align herself with financial instability, no matter how much she cared for him. She quietly ended the romantic aspect of the relationship, though his devotion was so deep that he continued to send her a Valentine's Day card every year for the rest of his life. She also received a serious proposal from David Ormsby Gore, Lord Harlech, the former British ambassador to the United States and a close friend of JFK. They traveled together to Cambodia in 1967. Lord Harlech was brilliant, aristocratic, and deeply in love with her. He offered a respectable, safe life in the English countryside, but Jackie turned him down. She wrote him a heartbreaking letter explaining her rejection. She told him that she loved him as a brother, but that marrying him would mean living entirely in the shadow of the past, surrounded by the same people and the same memories of Jack. She needed a complete severing from the Kennedy world to survive. By late 1967, a creeping, dark paranoia began to consume her. The civil rights movement, the Vietnam War protests, and escalating political violence were tearing the United States apart. Robert F. Kennedy, JFK's brother, had become her closest confidant, her protector, and a surrogate father to her children. Their relationship was intensely close, blurring the lines between family and emotional dependency. But as RFK geared up for his own presidential run in 1968, Jackie watched the crowd swarm him with a sickening sense of déjà vu. She saw the same lack of security, the same fervent adoration, and the same terrifying exposure that had killed her husband. The trauma of Dallas was no longer just a memory. It was a living, breathing threat. She began to realize that as long as she carried the Kennedy name, she and her children would never be safe. She needed a fortress, and she was preparing to make a deal with the devil to get it. The year 1968 broke the United States, and it permanently severed Jacqueline Kennedy's remaining ties to the American political establishment. Since Dallas, her survival had been heavily dependent on her brother-in-law, Robert F. Kennedy. RFK had stepped into the void left by Jack. He became her confidant, her protector, and a surrogate father to her traumatized children, John and Caroline. Their bond was intense, forged in the fires of shared grief. But when RFK announced his own run for the presidency, Jackie watched with mounting dread. She saw the massive, chaotic crowds swarming him. She recognized the exact same vulnerability that had gotten her husband killed. On June 5, 1968, inside the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, her nightmare repeated itself. Bobby Kennedy was gunned down. When RFK died, something fundamental inside Jackie snapped. The stoic endurance she had maintained for 5 years evaporated, replaced by a cold, absolute terror. This was no longer just a tragic coincidence. It was a pattern. She looked at her 2 young children and realized they carried a name that functioned as a target. If they're killing Kennedys, she confided to her inner circle, then my children are targets. I want to get out of this country. She was no longer concerned with protecting the Camelot myth. She was concerned with basic physical survival. She needed an impenetrable fortress. She needed an escape route out of the United States, and she knew exactly who could provide it. Aristotle Onassis was a Greek shipping magnate. He was one of the wealthiest men on the planet. He was also everything the Kennedys despised. He was physically unimposing, aggressively crude, and openly operated his business empire with a pirate's mentality. JFK had actively disliked him. RFK had despised him even more, reportedly stating before his death that Jackie would only marry Onassis over my dead body. But Onassis offered something the American government no longer could, a private mobile empire. He owned airlines, islands, and a massive private yacht equipped with a highly trained security force. There was, however, a massive toxic complication. Aristotle Onassis was currently the lover and intended husband of Jackie's younger sister, Lee Radziwill. For years, Lee had endured the humiliation of walking in Jackie's shadow. Her affair with Onassis was supposed to be her ultimate victory. The Greek billionaire was her ticket to a life of unimaginable wealth and global influence that would finally rival her sister's status. Jackie knew this, and she took him anyway. The decision to marry Onassis was a masterclass in ruthless pragmatism. It was not a romance. It was a cold, calculated transaction. Jackie was purchasing a private army and a global sanctuary for her children. In exchange, Onassis was acquiring the ultimate trophy wife. He was buying the most famous, most admired woman in the world, validating his own ego on a planetary scale. But beneath the surface of this transaction lay the brutal undercurrent of sibling revenge. By taking Onassis, Jackie executed a lethal psychological strike against her sister. It was the climax of a rivalry that had begun in their childhood nursery. Jackie effectively annihilated Lee's future, proving once and for all that she could and would take whatever she wanted. On October 20, 1968, just 4 months after Bobby Kennedy's murder, 39-year-old Jacqueline Kennedy married 62-year-old Aristotle Onassis on his heavily guarded private island of Scorpios. The global backlash was instantaneous and vicious. The American public felt utterly betrayed. They had canonized her as the saintly, grieving widow of their martyred president. To see her marry a much older, foreign billionaire, a man perceived as vulgar and corrupt, shattered the illusion she had so carefully built. Headlines around the world screamed, "Jackie, how could you?" and the end of Camelot. The Kennedy family was disgusted, viewing the marriage as an insult to Jack's memory. The Catholic Church openly threatened to excommunicate her, as Onassis was a divorced man whose first wife was still living. Even her own mother, Janet, horrified by the social implications, had begged Jackie to call off the wedding just hours before the ceremony. Jackie completely ignored them all. By marrying Onassis, she officially forfeited her right to United States Secret Service protection, but she no longer needed it. She had successfully traded public adoration for private security. She let the press scream. She was finally safe. But the reality of the marriage quickly revealed itself as a sterile corporate arrangement. Before the wedding, the terms of their union were hammered out by lawyers in a highly detailed prenuptial agreement. It was devoid of romance. They were to maintain separate bedrooms. Jackie was explicitly freed from any obligation to bear his children. The financial stipulations laid bare the exact nature of the trade. Jackie was granted a personal allowance of $10,000 a month. She received an additional $10,000 specifically for clothing. She was allocated $7,000 a month for medical and beauty expenses and $5,000 for the care of each of her children. Almost immediately, the transaction soured. Once the thrill of the acquisition faded, Onassis realized that his new wife was not going to play the role of the obedient, adoring Greek spouse. Jackie spent his money with terrifying efficiency. She maintained her own schedule, traveled extensively, and showed zero interest in his business affairs or his cultural background. She treated him not as a husband, but as a bank and a bodyguard. Onassis, a man unaccustomed to being used, grew furious. He began referring to her behind her back as the witch. He retaliated in the only way he knew how. Public humiliation. He deliberately and openly resumed his long-standing, passionate affair with the legendary opera singer Maria Callas. He made sure Jackie knew about it. But for Jackie, the brutal coping mechanism forged during her father's scandals remained firmly intact. Onassis's indiscretions did not threaten her financial or physical security, so she viewed them with absolute, chilling indifference. This indifference enraged Onassis further. He decided to strike her where she was most vulnerable, her heavily guarded public image. In November 1972, Jackie was vacationing on Scorpios. Believing she was completely secure on her husband's private island, she went to a secluded beach and sunbathed nude. She did not know that her own husband had arranged for her privacy to be violated. Frustrated by her coldness and seeking a bizarre form of revenge, Onassis personally tipped off a team of paparazzi. He provided them with a boat, maps of the island, and the exact time she would be alone on the beach. Armed with military-grade telephoto lenses, the photographers captured a series of highly intrusive, explicit images of the former First Lady naked. Onassis allowed the photos to be leaked to the European press. But the ultimate humiliation occurred in August 1975, when American pornographic publisher Larry Flynt purchased the images for $18,000. Flynt published them in an issue of Hustler magazine. The publication was a global scandal. The woman who had defined American elegance was put on display in a pornographic magazine. The psychological impact on her children was devastating. John Jr. and Caroline were brutally bullied and harassed by their peers at school. Throughout the entire ordeal, Jackie maintained her ironclad stoicism. She never issued a statement. She never cried in public. She endured the ultimate public shaming without letting the world see her break. And she had absolutely no idea that the man sleeping in the bedroom down the hall was the one who had orchestrated the entire attack. By 1973, the Onassis empire began to collapse under the weight of an actual tragedy. Alexander Onassis, Aristotle's only son and the heir to his massive shipping fortune, was killed in a plane crash in Athens. The death destroyed Aristotle Onassis. He aged decades in a matter of weeks. His daughter, Christina Onassis, was also devastated, but her grief immediately turned into a weapon aimed directly at Jackie. Christina had hated Jackie from the moment her father married her. She viewed the American woman as a gold digger who had stolen her father's attention. But after Alexander's death, Christina's hatred evolved into a dark, superstitious paranoia. She openly and loudly blamed Jackie for the crash. Christina claimed that Jackie had brought the Kennedy curse into their family, labeling her a harbinger of death and tragedy. She demanded that her father divorce, the which immediately, broken by grief and manipulated by his daughter, Aristotle Onassis agreed. He instructed his lawyers to begin secretly drafting divorce papers. He wanted to use the private investigator files he had accumulated on Jackie's spending and movements to force her out with a minimal payout, but his body failed before his lawyers could strike. In early 1975, Aristotle Onassis's health rapidly deteriorated. He was flown to a hospital in Paris, suffering from severe respiratory failure caused by myasthenia gravis. When he died on March 15, 1975, Jackie was thousands of miles away in New York. The divorce had not been finalized. Legally, she was still his wife. Christina Onassis immediately locked down the family fortune. She barred Jackie from accessing the Onassis properties and prepared for a brutal legal war, determined to leave her despised stepmother with nothing. Christina grossly underestimated her opponent. Jackie had survived Black Jack Bouvier, the Kennedy political machine, and the trauma of Dallas. She was not going to be intimidated by a grieving heiress. Jackie assembled a lethal legal team and launched a massive counteroffensive in the Greek courts. She systematically dismantled Christina's attempts to freeze her out. The legal battle was ugly, highly publicized, and fiercely fought. But Jackie held the superior legal ground. Recognizing that a drawn-out court battle would expose too many of the family's dark financial secrets to the global press, Christina finally capitulated. In a quiet, ironclad settlement, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis walked away from the wreckage of her second marriage with a payout of $26 million. At 45 years old, she was a two-time widow. She had endured assassination, public humiliation, and vicious familial warfare. But as the ink dried on the Onassis settlement, a profound shift occurred. For the first time in her entire life, She possessed massive, independent wealth that was not tied to the behavior or the demands of a husband. She was finally absolutely free. The $26 million settlement from the Onassis estate was not merely a fortune. It was an emancipation proclamation. In the spring of 1975, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis returned to New York City. For the first time in her 46 years, she was entirely untethered. She was no longer Black Jack Bouvier's pawn. She was no longer the Kennedy family's political weapon. And she was no longer the Greek billionaire's exotic trophy. The psychological armor she had worn for decades, the whispery voice, the passive smile, the calculated submission to powerful men, was systematically dismantled. She retreated to her sprawling 15-room apartment at 1040 Fifth Avenue, overlooking Central Park. But unlike the widows of high society who faded into quiet philanthropy and afternoon teas, Jackie executed a pivot that stunned the American public. She decided to get a job. To the elite circles of New York, a former First Lady entering the conventional workforce was unthinkable. It was viewed as a bizarre degradation of her status. But Jackie understood something they did not. True power was not just having money. It was having a purpose that no one could take away. In September 1975, she accepted a position as a consulting editor at Viking Press. Her salary was a mere $200 a week. The publishing industry assumed her hiring was a cheap public relations stunt orchestrated by Viking's president, Thomas Ginsburg. They expected her to be a decorative figurehead who would show up occasionally for lavish lunches. They drastically underestimated her work ethic. Jackie arrived at the office, sat at a standard desk, and went to work. She pitched ideas, she chased down elusive authors, and she meticulously line-edited manuscripts. Her choice of career was not a coincidence. For her entire adult life, her narrative had been aggressively manipulated by politicians, press secretaries, paparazzi, and hostile family members. She had been written about, analyzed, and consumed by the global public. Becoming an editor was the ultimate psychological reclamation. By working in publishing, she was finally sitting on the other side of the desk. She was the one shaping the narratives, controlling the text, and deciding what stories deserved to be told. However, she maintained a brutal, non-negotiable boundary regarding her own trauma. In 1977, Viking Press acquired the rights to a thriller novel titled Shall We Tell the President? By British author Jeffrey Archer. The plot revolved around a fictional assassination attempt on Senator Ted Kennedy, who in the book had been elected president. When Jackie discovered that her own employer was preparing to profit from a fictionalized assassination of her brother-in-law, capitalizing on the very real blood that had soaked her own clothes in Dallas and Los Angeles, her reaction was swift and lethal. She did not throw a tantrum. She did not ask for a meeting to express her feelings. She simply drafted a cold, surgically precise resignation letter and walked out the door. I resigned because of my conviction that the publication of such a book is in poor taste, she stated plainly. She severed ties with Thomas Ginsburg, a man who had been a close personal friend, without a second thought. She immediately moved to Doubleday, where she worked as a senior editor for the rest of her life, bringing in massive commercial hits and critically acclaimed historical volumes. She had proven that her dignity was not for sale. Not even to her friends. As her professional identity solidified, her personal life underwent a profound transformation. She had spent her youth drawn to dangerous, charismatic predators, men who thrived on chaos and control. But in her late 40s, she finally broke the pattern. She found Maurice Tempelsman. Tempelsman was a Belgian-born industrialist and a highly successful diamond merchant. He was wealthy, but his wealth was quiet, steady, and discreet. He possessed none of the flashy arrogance of John F. Kennedy or the crude volatility of Aristotle Onassis. He was intellectual, soft-spoken, and deeply respectful of her boundaries. Their relationship evolved slowly from a friendship rooted in shared intellectual interests into a profound romantic partnership. Tempelsman offered her something she had never experienced, a safe harbor. He did not want to use her image to win an election, and he did not want to show her off on a yacht to intimidate his rivals. He simply wanted her company. There was, however, a catch that would have caused a massive scandal in her earlier life. Templesman was married, and his wife, an Orthodox Jewish woman, strictly refused to grant him a divorce. Decades earlier, Jackie would have fled from a relationship that lacked the legal and social sanction of marriage. But in her 50s, she no longer cared about the rules of the aristocracy or the moral judgments of the press. She invited Templesman to live with her at 1040 Fifth Avenue. They lived together openly. They walked her dogs in Central Park. They ate at quiet restaurants, and they spent their evenings reading in the same room. It was the most stable, loving, and authentic relationship of her entire life, precisely because it existed entirely on her own terms, outside the confines of a legal contract. She reclaimed her joy. The heavy, tragic aura of the grieving widow dissipated. In 1991, at the age of 62, she attended an event at the Metropolitan Opera. She arrived on the arm of the young, wildly popular Hollywood actor Alec Baldwin. She looked radiant, relaxed, and effortlessly glamorous. She was entirely in control of her own gravity. But the ghosts of her childhood were not done with her. In the late 1980s, her mother, Janet Auchincloss, began to suffer from severe dementia and Alzheimer's disease. As Janet's mind deteriorated, the polished, high society facade she had maintained her entire life crumbled, leaving behind only her raw, unfiltered instincts. Jackie stepped up as the dutiful daughter. Despite a lifetime of emotional distance and the brutal pragmatism her mother had always shown her, Jackie managed her mother's medical care, visited her constantly, and ensured she was comfortable. Lee, living a turbulent life in Europe, was largely absent. Yet, even in the fog of Alzheimer's, Janet's core psychological dynamics remained violently intact. The toxic favoritism that had poisoned the Bouvier sisters' childhood resurfaced for one final, devastating strike. During one of her lucid periods near the end of her life, Janet made a major financial decision. She arranged to secretly transfer a massive sum of money, $750,000, directly to Lee Radziwill. When the transfer was discovered, the reasoning behind it was a sharp slap to Jackie's face. Janet, or the lawyers acting on her unfiltered wishes, indicated that the money was given to Lee specifically to make up for favoring Jackie in the past. For Jackie, the sting was profound. It was not about the money. She was vastly wealthier than her mother. It was about the realization that her mother's love had always been a transactional ledger. It was a brutal reminder that the family disease, the constant weighing of worth, the pitting of sister against sister, the manipulative distribution of affection, had never been cured. Even on her deathbed, Janet was still playing the game, still dividing her daughters, still feeding the lifelong rivalry. Janet Auchincloss died in 1989. Jackie buried her mother with the requisite grace, but the emotional wound inflicted by that final financial gesture calcified. It served as a grim reminder of how deeply Lee had resented her, and how their mother had enabled that toxic resentment until her dying breath. A few years later, the final chapter of Jackie's own life began with a quiet, terrifying symptom. In late 1993, she fell from her horse during a hunt in Virginia. She was bruised, but the lingering pain in her groin did not subside. In December, she developed a persistent cough and swollen lymph nodes in her neck. Her doctors initially misdiagnosed it as an infection, but a biopsy in January 1994 delivered the fatal verdict: non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Cancer is a disease that strips away control, but Jackie refused to be a passive victim. She approached her mortality with the same steely, analytical pragmatism she had applied to the White House restoration and her publishing career. She continued to work at Doubleday, bringing manuscripts to her chemotherapy sessions. Maurice Templesman never left her side. He converted a room in her apartment into a medical suite. He managed her doctors, monitored her medications, and guarded her privacy with absolute ferocity. He was the protector she had always deserved, arriving just in time to walk her to the end. By early May 1994, the cancer had aggressively metastasized, spreading to her brain and spinal cord. The doctors informed her that the disease was no longer responding to treatment. For the American medical establishment of the 1990s, the default protocol was to fight until the bitter end, to keep the patient alive on machines for as long as possible. But Jackie possessed an innate aristocratic dignity. She had watched her first husband die in a chaotic, blood-soaked emergency room under the glaring lights of history. She was absolutely determined to orchestrate her own exit. When she was told the treatments were futile, she gave a single, definitive order: stop everything. She refused any further chemotherapy. She refused to be transferred to a hospital to die hooked up to monitors. She demanded to be taken home. She signed the papers, closed the door to the outside world, and prepared to deliver her final verdict. When Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis instructed her doctors to stop all medical interventions in May 1994, she was not giving up. She was simply taking control of the final variable. She had lived her entire adult life under the relentless, glaring lights of public scrutiny and historical expectation. She was determined that her death would happen entirely in the shadows, strictly on her own terms. She returned to her apartment at 1040 Fifth Avenue. The physical space was a fortress she had curated over decades, filled with rare books, antiquities, and the quiet devotion of her partner, Maurice Templesman. Outside the building, a massive crowd of journalists, television crews, and ordinary citizens gathered, standing vigil on the sidewalks of Central Park. The world was waiting for the inevitable, but inside the apartment, the atmosphere was rigidly controlled. There were no hysterics. There were no politicians allowed in to pay their respects. The guest list for her final days was stripped down to the absolute essentials. Her children, John and Caroline, her closest friends, and Templesman. On the evening of May 19, 1994, at 10:15 p.m., Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis died. She was 64 years old. The following morning, John F. Kennedy Jr. stepped out of the apartment building to address the massive press corps waiting on the street. He did not deliver a sweeping, emotional eulogy. He spoke with the same crisp, pragmatic composure that his mother had spent a lifetime perfecting. "My mother passed on," John Jr. told the cameras. "She was surrounded by her friends and her family and her books and the people and the things that she loved. And she did it in her own way and on her own terms, and we all feel lucky for that." Her funeral was a stark, deliberate rejection of the grand, state-sponsored theater she had orchestrated for her first husband 31 years earlier. When JFK died, Jackie had required the entire nation to watch the caissons, the riderless horse, and the massive procession. She used that funeral to forge a political myth. But her own funeral was private. The service was held at St. Ignatius Loyola, the same Roman Catholic church on Park Avenue where she had been baptized. There were no television cameras allowed inside. The guest list was tightly restricted. Maurice Templesman stood at the altar and read the poem Ithaca by C.P. Cavafy, a quiet nod to her love of literature and her turbulent journey. She was then flown to Arlington National Cemetery. She was buried next to John F. Kennedy and their two deceased infant children, Arabella and Patrick. The eternal flame she had commissioned decades earlier illuminated the gravesite. With her burial complete, the public assumed the story of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis had concluded. They were wrong. She had one final, devastating act to perform. The true climax of Jackie's life did not occur at her funeral. It occurred in a lawyer's office in Manhattan, when her last will and testament was formally unsealed and entered into probate. A last will and testament is fundamentally a legal document. But for a woman who had spent her life communicating through calculated gestures, strategic silence, and visual armor, her will was the ultimate psychological manifesto. It was her final opportunity to settle scores, establish permanent boundaries, and distribute her staggering wealth exactly as she saw fit, free from any fear of retaliation. At the time of her death, Her estate was estimated to be worth between $150 million and $200 million. It was an empire built from the Onassis settlement, her sharp real estate investments, and decades of compounding financial growth managed by Templesman. The document was meticulous. She left substantial cash gifts to her personal staff, ensuring the financial security of the people who had actually protected her privacy. She left $250,000 to her personal secretary, Nancy Tuckerman. She distributed highly valuable, specific historical artifacts to close friends. She set up massive, airtight trusts for John and Caroline, ensuring the Kennedy children would never be financially dependent on the Kennedy Family Trust. She also established a $500,000 trust fund for each of her sister Lee Radziwill's two children, Anthony and Tina, and then the document delivered its lethal blow. Regarding her only sister, Caroline Lee Bouvier Radziwill, Jackie included a specific, deeply humiliating clause. The will stated, "I have made no provision in this my will for my sister, Lee B. Radziwill, for whom I have already provided during my lifetime." Lee Radziwill was entirely disinherited. She did not receive a single cent. She did not receive a piece of jewelry, a painting, or a written sentiment. She was legally and permanently erased from the inheritance. To the untrained eye, the phrasing seemed polite, almost bureaucratic. The excuse that she had already provided for Lee referenced the fact that Jackie had occasionally bailed her sister out of financial trouble in the past. But in the ruthless, coded language of the American aristocracy, the meaning was unmistakable. It was a psychological execution. If Jackie had simply wanted to save money, she could have left Lee a token amount, $50,000, or a piece of furniture, just to maintain the facade of sisterly affection. By explicitly writing Lee out of the will and naming her in the process, Jackie was making a public declaration. Once a will is entered into probate, it becomes a public historical document. Jackie knew exactly what she was doing. She was ensuring that history recorded her final verdict on her sister. This was the culmination of a toxic war that had started in the nursery of their childhood. It was the final retaliation for Black Jack Bouvier's favoritism. It was the punishment for Lee showing up to Jackie's debutante ball in a rhinestone dress to steal the spotlight. It was the penalty for Lee's lifelong jealousy. And, most brutally, it was the ultimate, inescapable retribution for Lee's rumored affair with John F. Kennedy, and for their mother, Janet, handing Lee $750,000 on her deathbed to make up for Jackie's success. Jackie had previously taken Lee's intended husband, Aristotle Onassis. Now, from beyond the grave, she took away the one thing Lee craved most, validation. By giving $500,000 to Lee's children but nothing to Lee herself, Jackie asserted total dominance. She effectively communicated, "I will take care of your children because you cannot, and I owe you absolutely nothing." Lee Radziwill was forced to endure the humiliation publicly. When the press caught wind of the disinheritance, it became a massive global story. Lee could not fight back. She could not argue with a dead woman. Jackie had secured the last word, and she had written it in stone. It was a masterpiece of cold, calculated revenge, executed by a woman who had survived a lifetime of betrayals by never forgetting a single one. The aftermath of her death triggered a bizarre, unprecedented cultural phenomenon that proved how completely she had hypnotized the American public. In her will, Jackie had instructed her children to sell off the items in her estate that they did not want to keep to help cover the massive estate taxes. In April 1996, John and Caroline partnered with Sotheby's auction house in New York to auction off a portion of their mother's belongings. The planners at Sotheby's anticipated a successful auction, estimating the total take to be around $4.6 million. They drastically underestimated the public's feral obsession with Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. The Sotheby's auction became a global frenzy. It was not just wealthy collectors who participated. It was ordinary citizens desperate to own a physical piece of the myth. People viewed the items not as objects, but as holy relics. The prices skyrocketed to absurd, irrational levels. A set of Jackie's fake pearls, costume jewelry worth perhaps $200 at a standard vintage shop, sold for $211,500. A set of JFK's McGregor golf clubs, estimated to be worth $900, was purchased by Arnold Schwarzenegger for $772,500. A small tarnished silver tape measure sold for $48,875. Even the worn, upholstered footstools from her living room sparked aggressive bidding wars. Over 4 days, the auction brought in an astonishing $34.5 million. The Sotheby's auction was the ultimate proof of the illusion Jackie had built. The public was spending millions of dollars to buy her used ashtrays and fake jewelry because they were still buying into the fantasy of Camelot. They wanted the elegance, the tragedy, and the proximity to power. They were purchasing the armor she had left behind, completely unaware of the hardened, ruthless survivor who had actually worn it. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis's legacy is often reduced to a caricature of fashion and silent suffering. Textbooks remember her for her pillbox hats, her restoration of the White House, and the horrific imagery of Dallas. She is frequently categorized as the ultimate victim of the 20th century, a woman who lost a husband to an assassin's bullet, lost another to illness, and buried 3 children. But viewing her as a victim is a fundamental miscalculation of who she was. She was a brilliant, highly adaptable political strategist. She understood that in a media-driven century, whoever controls the image controls the power. When she was surrounded by the toxic, predatory behavior of the men in her life, from her father to her husbands, she did not break. She compartmentalized. She learned their weaknesses, used their resources, and built her own impenetrable empire. She recognized that the American political establishment would gladly use her trauma for its own gain, so she weaponized that trauma first. She refused to change her blood-stained suit to punish the men who failed to protect her husband. She dictated the terms of JFK's historical memory by feeding the Camelot myth to a compliant journalist. And when the Kennedy name became too dangerous for her children, she executed a flawless, emotionless corporate merger with Aristotle Onassis to buy her way out of the crosshairs. She was not a saint, and she was not a fairy tale queen. She was a woman born into a gilded cage who realized early on that the only way to survive the crushing machinery of American power was to outsmart it. She endured public humiliation, profound grief, and vicious family warfare, and she emerged with her mind intact, her fortune secured, and her independence absolute. In the end, she stripped away the titles. She was no longer First Lady, and she was no longer Mrs. Onassis. She was simply an editor living in New York, commanding her own life, dictating her own terms, and deciding exactly who would pay for the sins of the past. She survived the 20th century, not by relying on the men who claimed to love her, but by relying entirely on the cold, sharp intellect she had hidden behind her smile since she was a little girl.